good afternoon, everyone. I understand you've had a little bit of a break, which is good news for me. So maybe you feel a little bit more refreshed, because I know you've had a pretty intense day before me. So let's see how this goes. I'm going to talk about the EEA Norway Grants. My name is Eva Kløve, and I am the head of the Priority Sectors Unit in the FMO, the Financial Mechanisms Office. And that somewhat cryptic name is actually the Secretariat to the donors, Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein, in charge of managing the EEA and Norway grants. So that's why we are here in Brussels. Would you mind giving me the presentation mode slides?
This one is just the same as the one above.
Okay, then I think I would need to have my laptop so I have my notes. I mean, I can run through it, but it will be more informative if I also have my notes to stick with. It's okay?
Just go get your... And
I have it here.
This opportunity to do my favorite thing, fix the mic.
Okay. All right, let's see if we can multitask.
All right.
Sorry about that little glitch. There was a little misunderstanding. Okay. In the meantime, you can study the EEA agreement. I think you have been discussing it already this morning.
Tell me if I'm hurting you.
I have two sisters, so I can.
You're used to it.
I'm used to it.
Okay, now I think it's good.
Yeah. All right. My laptop, on the other hand, does not want to cooperate with me. Which is a little less more unfortunate. Yeah. So if you have it there, it looks like I have a problem. Anyway, I can in any case, sorry for the glitches here in the beginning. I can in any case start by saying that this is basically the legal basis for the EEA Norway Grants, the EEA agreement, which is also sort of summarizing one of our two main objectives, which is basically to reduce economic and social disparities in Europe, and specifically in the 15 beneficiary states that we work with. So you can see here, Articles 115 to 117 states that the contracting parties agree on the need to reduce the economic and social disparities between their regions. And from Protocol 38C, which is specific to this particular funding period for the grants, it states that the EEA and EFTA states shall contribute to the reduction of economic and social disparities in the European Economic Area, and that the strengthening of their relations with the beneficiary states. And the last part of this protocol came in place for the mechanism before this one for the first time, and meaning that we now have two overall objectives. So on the one hand, contributing to reducing economic and social disparities, and on the other hand, contributing to strengthening bilateral relations with the countries. This means that we have a lot of donor states, partners involved in the grants, the way we are working. Do you have the laptop for me now? Thank you very much. There you go. Oh, it's popped to another. There. Yeah. Yes. All right. So then I have to manage two things here. See if I can do that. This is another way of saying the same thing. Basically, our two overall goals with a sort of a picture here of what these bilateral relationships can be about, although in most cases it's a little less intense, should I say, than in this particular picture. But basically, if you think about the first objective here, that's really what the EU talks about as cohesion, contributing to a more cohesive Europe. And the second objective then is, as I mentioned, to bring in donor states partners, to work with our beneficiary states, and then to bring knowledge exchanges, technical expertise, and partnerships through the programs that we work on. So, in short, the grants are about more equality and more cooperation. All right. This is, I mentioned briefly the funding periods. The grants work in funding periods. We call them financial mechanisms, thereby the cryptic name of the FMO, the Financial Mechanisms Office. Everything has an explanation. We have had now 3 periods. The first one, 2004 to 2009, was 1.3 billion euros. And you can see that it has gradually increased. And last time, very substantially so, to 2.8 billion euros over that 7-year period. The first 2 periods were 5 years. The period, though, add to the confusion in some sense, because in the current period was negotiated, the negotiations were completed in 2016. So even though it says 2014 to 2021, we are still in the middle of implementation. And the end date of eligibility is April 2024. So it's not entirely, not at all really corresponding to these timeframes. But that's how it is. This slide, you can make you see it as well, shows the distribution of the funds between countries and between the 2 mechanisms. We have the EEA grants and we have the Norway grants. And you can see that for the EEA grants, that's about 1.5 billion euros versus the Norway grants, which constitute about 1.3 billion. So 96% of the EEA grants come from Norway, 3% come from Iceland, and 1% come from Liechtenstein. And goes without saying, everything from the Norway grants come from Norway. The 15 beneficiary states that we are working with have been selected because they have a gross national income less than 90% of the average of the EU. So they are among the poorest beneficiary, or the poorest countries in Europe. This also shows you the countries that are part of the collaboration. You can see that for Hungary, where is Hungary? In the middle there, there is an amount allocated, but in fact, we signed an MOU with Hungary for the current funding period, but the donor states could not reach an agreement with Hungary on the appointment of a fund operator for the civil society funds. And that was obviously quite a controversial issue, still is. And as a consequence of not agreeing on a fund operator, the collaboration basically broke down, and we don't have any programs we are implementing in Hungary for this financial period. This is a little bit about the grant cycle. It goes, as I mentioned, over a period of 7 years currently. It starts with negotiations between the donor states and the EU. That's where we are now for the next funding period. And at some point, hopefully, they agree on an MOU with each country. And from there, you develop concept notes for the different programs in each country, a program agreement for each of the programs, and then, of course, implementing the programs, which is the phase we are currently in with this mechanism. And we have a program model in the EEA Norway Grants, which means that the countries themselves are responsible for managing the programs and the projects. So we have around 97 programs totally, and we have at the moment almost around 5,000 projects. And the reason why we have so many projects is because in most cases, the projects are selected in open tenders. So you will have call tags going out, and you will have an application process whereby private entities, public entities can apply for fundings in the countries, and they will then have a proper tendering process and a selection procedure where we are also involved and select the projects that we will eventually then fund. So this, the number of projects for that reason is still increasing. So the program approach is good in the sense that it brings ownership to the countries. It's their programs. But it's also a complex model to manage because ultimately we don't have influence over the project level. Of course, we discuss, we have soft powers, but it's really the country's programs in the end. So that's something that sets the current mechanism and the previous one apart from the first one, where a lot of the projects were directly contracted by the FMO. This is how we are set up. The blue boxes are the stakeholders on the donor side, and the gray boxes are the stakeholders on the beneficiary states. So you can see there are a lot of actors involved, and it's quite a complex setup. So at the very top there, you see the donor states and the FMO as the secretariat. And the FMO, of course, we are in contact with the beneficiary states. You see the gray boxes there, the national focal point, which is our contact point with each country. So we have one national focal point in each country. And then you have the program operators who manage the programs. So the national focal point has a coordination role vis-a-vis the program operators. And in many cases, the national focal point is a Ministry of Regional Cooperation and EU funds, typically. But they can also come from other ministries. And then we have the program operators, in most cases, are line ministries. It can be Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Energy, Ministry of the Environment. So that's a little bit the partners that we work with at the country level. And then you will see that on the right side there, we have donor program partners and international partner organizations. The international partner organizations are the OECD, the Council of Europe, and the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency. And we work with them mostly at the program level in their areas of expertise. And the donor program partners, we have a whole lot of them. I'm not going to go through all of that, but most of them come from Norway, and they are also, in most cases, directorates, although sometimes also ministries. And then they work on the specific programs in their respective sectors. We also have some directly contracted programs and funds, as you can see on the left side, where we have a different role. And that is particularly so with the civil society programs, but also with some of our other programs. So some characteristics of the grants are that we are results-oriented. We have a whole results and evaluation unit, so they follow up each and every program with a results-based approach. And they also, we have the overall objectives, of course. We have outcome results at the program level, and we also have results frameworks at the project level. So it's quite an intense sort of way of following up the results of the grants, where all the partners have to report on the results to the FMO and eventually to the donors. So that's a very important part of our sort of modus operandi. I mentioned the donor partners involved both at the program and project levels. And then finally, the support to civil society with the very important principle that these are independent of the beneficiary states' governments. And this was, in fact, one of the issues with Hungary, that the fund operator was not seen as independent. All right, a little bit about what we fund. This is our blue book, our strategy document. It shows the priority sectors, explains the name of my unit, the priority sectors unit. We have 5 sectors, spanning a whole lot of different sectors and areas. And we have 23 program areas. So you can see them here. And you can see that, of course, this requires on our side expertise in a whole lot of different sectors and areas in addition to some of the cross-country issues that we deal with, because in the protocol also there is reference to common values such as human rights, democracy, good governance, etc. So we also, of course, have to ensure that those are operationalized to the extent possible. So these are the areas we work in. This shows you a little bit about the magnitude of funding in each area. So in innovation and research, we have about 600 million, social inclusion 380 million, etc., etc. So that shows you a little bit what sectors are important, more important in monetary terms to us. We also have the bilateral funds, which is part of the other category here. Now, another way of looking at this is through the slogan, motto of Together for a Green, Competitive and Inclusive Europe. That is actually the slogan for the current mechanism. So we still have our 2 overall objectives, but in addition we have this slogan for this period, and our colleagues in the Results and Evaluation Department have split our programs into whether they belong in the inclusive, the competitive, or the green categories. So I will show you some of the results that we are planning for. These are still planned results in each of these 3 areas. And that will then conclude my presentation. So for the green area, these are some of the there you go. These are some of the targets that we have on CO2 emissions, on renewable energy produced, and estimated energy savings, and number of habitats with improved ecological status. So these are all the programs within energy, environment, and climate change. To give a little bit more meat on the bone, this is an example from a project in Romania, an energy project of 237 euros, sorry, 1,000 euros, where they, as you can see, produce solar panels. For the competitive part, we have that was the Romania project, my apologies. And these are the competitive targets, where we aim to support almost 1,000 SMEs in business development. In that case, through the innovation programs, we often provide some funding, and then we have requirements for co-financing, which means that we can benefit from greater investment than just through our own funds. We have, through the research programs, support of a number of researchers, creating jobs, and also training professional staff. Of course, these are some of the targets at the output levels, but at the outcome level, at the higher up the results chain, we have ambitions to change systems and contribute at a higher level to a competitive Europe. For this, we have an example from Bulgaria in Stara Zagora, and this is where you can see a production line for retreading heavyweight industrial tires using clean technology. So a lot of our projects, both in innovation actually and in the energy and environment climate change sectors, focus on these kinds of projects. For the inclusive set of programs, we have targets around civil society organizations that we fund, number of people that are engaged in the activities that they support. Roma inclusion is a very important part of what we do, because at the aggregate and in the protocol, it stipulates that we should support vulnerable groups. And then generally, of course, trying to reach as many beneficiaries as possible and influence also policies and laws. So this is an example from Romania again. It's a local development program from Kløve. And it's on decent housing and social services. Here we have more than 300 families, 710 people, and 80% of them are Roma who live close to a landfill in Romania with limited access to water and electricity. So through this project, 34 families are offered social housing and also social services that are provided to them as part of that. This is a slightly larger grant. Again, this is 4.2 million euros. We have also organized our grants in terms of the SDGs. Without going into much details, happy to provide more if you would like, but we can see that the grants also contribute to each of the SDGs. I assume you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals? I see some nods. Good. So a little bit about the next funding period. So basically, I mentioned in the beginning that the 3 donor states, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, and the EU have already agreed to continue, that there is a need to continue supporting reduction of economic and social disparities. This was done last summer. And the negotiation then for the current, or for the next funding period started in June this year. We don't know how long that process will be. It was quite slow last time, and it's already quite delayed in terms of what we had hoped for. But what we know is that some of the topics that will be on the table for the negotiations are programs and initiatives related to the Green Deal, to democracy, rule of law, and human rights, for obvious reasons, and also resilience. So before I end my presentation, I understand there was a question around the impact of the war. And of course, many of the beneficiary states that we work with are neighboring countries to Ukraine, including Poland, Slovakia, Romania, and Hungary, but we don't work in Hungary as explained. So, of course, when you see this, it's probably evident that we are not set up as a humanitarian organization. These are long-term processes, long phases of developing programs with fixed plans and results frameworks sort of set from the start. But nevertheless, our countries were very affected, sometimes also at the personal level, especially in Poland, where there was such a large influx of Ukrainian refugees. And the donors wanted to support this. So we used the bilateral funds, which is, you know, in addition to the program funds, we have bilateral funds to support collaboration with the donor states partners. We used some of those funds to support the refugees and initiatives for the refugees. Altogether, we have so far spent, or reallocated, if you like, 12 million euros to this purpose. And we have received feedback from the beneficiary states that they have obviously welcomed this initiative from the donors. So yeah, I think that's what I am going to say about Ukraine for now, but happy to take any questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva. Before we shift gears a little bit, does anyone have a question for Eva here in the audience? Yes, I'll run to the back to hand the mic to this gentleman here.
Yes, thank you. So I have just one simple question. I saw the increase of monetary contribution over the last years, and I wanted to know how beneficiary would you assess these increasing contributions in terms of soft power towards the European Union from the position of Norway?
And you said simple question. That's not a simple question, I think. That's a question. We have like I said, we have an evaluation department. That's the kind of questions that an evaluation really should look at. But of course, the increase is also is due to the fact that the EU sees this as an important contribution from the donor countries and would like us to do more, obviously. But how it is perceived, how it influences negotiations in and of itself with the EU is really, I mean, it's beyond the Secretariat in some sense to respond to that question. But, you know, just drawing on logic, you can imagine that more funds provides more negotiation power. But from our perspective in the Secretariat, this is also a question of what is possible to spend in a certain period. Because we work with countries where there is weak capacity, heavy bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, political instability, not least in Bulgaria where they've had, I think, 4 governments in the last year. So for us, from a sort of program management perspective, more money is not necessarily better, to be very honest, because you have to allocate and spend the money in a way that makes sense and where you can use it most productively. So I know I didn't answer your question. Anyone else?
Thank you. My question is about the rationale for having Norway grants in addition to EEA grants.
Yes.
I hope this one is simple.
It's a funny one because in Norway, I mean, I assume there are some Norwegians in the room, we talk about the EEA grants. We don't actually talk about the EEA Norway grants in Norway. But in the EU setting, it is an important distinction. It has to do with the negotiation power of the 3 donor states involved, the Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And how they negotiate funds and how much they each contribute and how that is determined. But that's also slightly above my pay grade. So.
Thank you, Eva. In the interest of time, I think we will move on to the next presentation. Thank you so much for introducing us to the EEA Norway Grants and the Financial Mechanism Office. And obviously, you guys can find the EEA Norway Grants on the web and on social media. They're very active, so do check them out if anything.
And you can find us on the 3rd and 4th floor of this building, not least. So please come by and have coffee if you have further questions or you think of something after the presentation, because we're in the same house. Thank you.
Thank you.